Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get this webinar started. Hopefully people can join halfway through. First of all, a big thank you for joining. Hopefully everyone can see the screen okay. As you can probably see, this is the launch celebration webinar for Mass Observation Project. This is going to be about an hour webinar, including Q&A. Just before we get into what the webinar is going to cover today, I just want to very quickly introduce our speakers. So my name is Alex Butler. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager at Adam Matthew. I'm going to be chairing today's webinar and taking you through the new site. We're also going to be hearing from three esteemed speakers today. So we're going to be hearing from Professor Claire Langemer, Dorothy Sheridan, from the Keep Archive at Sussex, as well as Jill Kirby as well. And I'll leave them to all introduce themselves when we get to each of their sections. So what we're going to cover today really is a very quick introduction to who Adam Matthew are, as well as some housekeeping. We're going to do a brief introduction to mass observation. We realise some of you may not be that familiar with the archive and what's been digitised, so we're going to give you a very quick introduction to how mass observation started and where it is today. Then we're going to talk about the 1980s directives themselves. That's really the focus for this webinar. We're going to be talking about how those directives have made a real impact to teaching and research in their physical form. Then we're going to look at the new site itself. We're going to be doing a live demo followed by a Q&A. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. You'll see on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar, there is a chat function. So if you're having any technical issues throughout the webinar, feel free to pop something in the chat, and then one of my colleagues can hopefully assist you. Now, if you'd like to ask a question, that is a different window. So you should be able to see just right at the bottom of your sort of drop downs, there is a question function. You can submit questions throughout the whole webinar. We do ask you to type them in there, and then either we can answer them on the fly, or if they're questions that are more suitable for the group discussion at the end, I can chair and select a few of those. So please feel free to ask questions throughout. The last thing I'll say is please keep your microphone muted and your webcams off through the whole webinar. And this webinar is being recorded as well. So you will be receiving that recording in the next 48 hours. So please feel free to share that with any colleagues or friends that weren't able to attend today. So without further ado, I think we will get started. So first of all, a very quick introduction to who Adam Matthew are. So Adam Matthew are a publisher of digital primary source collections and platforms for the humanities and social sciences. We started as a microfilm publisher back in 1990, but since 2003, we've been producing digitized archival collections for teaching and research in a huge range of academic areas across the humanities and social sciences. All of the collections we produce are unique and completely bespoke and serve a wide range of academic areas. I've just listed a few examples of some of the collections we've published over the last few years, and they really do range from 15th century medieval manuscript through to mass observation online, which is the sort of the previous collection to what we're looking at today. Service newspapers, one of our newspaper collections, as well as larger multi-archive projects like food and drink in history. So yeah, we'd encourage you to go to our website. You can find more information about any of these collections there, as well as request a free trial. So that's a little bit about Adam Matthew. Just to kick this webinar off, I'm going to hand over now to Claire Langemer and Dorothy Sheridan, who are going to give us a very brief introduction to the origins of mass observation and where it is today.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everybody. My name's Claire Langhammer. I'm a historian at Sussex, and I'm also a trustee of the Mass Observation Archive. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the history of mass observation. So, on the 30th of January 1937, a letter appeared on the pages of the New Statesman, announcing the foundation of an ambitious and slightly odd-sounding organisation dedicated to the study of British life. Called Mass Observation, its aim was to conduct anthropology at home, or a science of ourselves. The authors outlined the somewhat eclectic range of topics that mass observation would apparently attend to. These included the behaviour of people at war memorials, the distribution, diffusion and significance of the dirty joke, and the private lives of midwives. The list implied that the ordinary was in fact extraordinary and worthy of sustained attention. A commitment to the study of every day in all of its messy complexity was to underpin mass observations work across the 20th century and into the 21st. By February 1937, mass observation had recruited a group of volunteer writers willing to record the details of their lives on the 12th of every month. This was to lead up to the record of everyday life on an unusual day, 12th of May 1937, the date set for George VI's coronation. The volunteer writers, who mass observation characterised as ordinary hard-working folk, were vital to the organisation's work. They remain so today, and without them, this wonderful new resource would not exist. As Mass Observation explained in one of its earliest publications, mass observation intends to work with a new method. It intends to make use not only of the trained scientific observer, but of the untrained observer, the man in the street. Ideally, it is the observation by everyone, of everyone, including themselves. Over time, the focus on diary keeping was opened out to include discussions of topics suggested by the organisation, such as objects on mantelpieces, thoughts on margarine, or views on the Munich crisis. Mass observation also investigated life in particular localities. The most sustained of these projects was a forensic study of Bolton in Lancashire, which they renamed Worktown. Across the war years, mass observation continued this work, providing historians with unparalleled access to home front life. But it also continued to collect diaries and monthly responses to what it called directives, essentially open-ended questionnaires, and it is this particular aspect of mass observation's work that was revived by the Mass Observation Project in 1981. The questions they asked are often surprising, and the responses were always thoughtful and often richly autobiographical. In 1942, for example, Mass Observation's writers responded to the question, what are your own personal feelings about death and dying? The end of the war did not bring an end to Mass Observation's research activities. It embarked on major post-war surveys of topics such as sex, drink, and capital punishment. The volunteer panel continued to submit diaries, and they also submitted responses to directives on topics as diverse as blindness, housework, and Princess Margaret's love life. My favourite set of responses is from the 1950s, when mass observers were asked, do you ever cry in the pictures? How far, if at all, do you feel ashamed on such occasions? But by the 60s, mass observation was no longer conducting the kinds of qualitative research we know it for today. In the early 1970s, the then Vice-Chancellor of Sussex University, the historian Asa Briggs, negotiated with Tom Harrison to bring the archive to Sussex University. It was open to historians in 1975. In 1981, Sussex anthropologist David Pocock reinvented mass observation as the current Mass Observation Project. In his appeal for new volunteer writers, he mirrored the language of mass observation's early years, saying that the experience of ordinary people is of particular importance. Dorothy Sheridan worked with Tom Harrison when the original papers first came to Sussex and has been central to the development of the Mass Observation Project since 1981. I'm now going to turn to Dorothy and Dorothy, ask you if you could introduce yourself, and then I have some questions for you.
Hello.
Hey Dorothy, would you like to introduce yourself first of all?
Yes. Well, Claire's done it really. I started working with Tom Harrison on a very part-time basis in 1974, not realizing how things would work out as they did. And I was a very junior secretary, I suppose. Anyway, the job just grew, as did the collection. And I'll explain that as I go on.
Okay, so the first question, Dorothy, that I'd like to ask you is, what was it about 1981 that made it a good time to reinvent mass observation?
Well, you know, I think it was really the advent of the royal wedding, Charles and Diana, because there was such a huge media clamour around that time, and that fired David Pocock's enthusiasm, and hence that was one of the first directives, asking people if they'd keep a diary of the day of the royal wedding. Royalty was an old preoccupation of mass observation, or rather public reactions to royalty, I should say, and it goes right back to their first observational book, which was May the 12th, an account of what people did at the coronation of 1937. For me, it was a little bit different. I was more explicitly interested in the politics of the period. It was a turmoil of a time, really, with troubles in Northern Ireland, the hunger strikes, unrest relating to racial tensions in British cities during that summer, a big concern about the high levels of unemployment and the recession. And in fact, we called the project the Inflation Project when we started, and we expected it to last maybe 5 years. And of course, I can't help but think of the parallels with today, which makes the 1981 material ripe for comparisons with the situation we're in today, facing another recession.
Absolutely. But in 1981, what did the Mass Observation Project hope to achieve?
Well, you know, we never spelt it out. I don't think, well, for a start, I don't think Pocock and I ever saw eye to eye exactly, but I think it's really important for researchers to know that it wasn't a properly funded academic research project with explicit aims and methods. It was more an experiment to see if we could do mass observation again. And we were both aware that we were living through a significant time. It was the start of the Thatcher years, of neoliberalism and monetarism. In fact, things were going to get very different. And of course, although Thatcher was quite unpopular in 81, her popularity soared in 82 after the Falklands-Malvinas War. So it was the start of this particular set of years, or decade of Thatcher years, which seemed really important to record. It was only gradually that I began to realise, with our sending out new directives, that we were creating a social document of Britain for the 80s and onwards, which was going to be comparable to the early mass observation. And it was also part of our immediate motivation to bring mass observation back into the public eye. It was always very controversial during the war and in the 30s. And as a small charity with only minimal support at that time, which was mostly from the University of Sussex, we desperately needed to attract funds to survive. But it was also important to me, and I do want to say this, to act as an advocate for mass observation. I was influenced by newish developments in oral history and feminist history, Black and working class history, because I believe that archives should contain the stories of ordinary people, if such a thing exists, but people who are not the rich and famous or the rich and powerful. But of course, we'd no idea that the project would take off as it did. And if you told me then we'd still be going on almost 40 years later, I would have been amazed. And of course, we must give credit to some of the people that contributed, many of them writing for years and years.
What was your role within the Mass Observation Project, Dorothy, and how did it change over time?
I think before 81, I'd been mostly concerned with trying to get the original archive into some kind of order, make it accessible for researchers, and helping people use the collection. As you said, I worked with Tom Harrison until he died in 1976. And then when we started the revival in 81, I played a bit of a backroom role. I acted as the typist and editor of the directives. I think I'd say my influence was subtle rather than active and upfront. David was a strong personality, a bit like Tom Harrison, you could say. At that time, of course, we had no computers, no email, no website, no databases, nothing digital. So everything was done by hand, including sending out hundreds of directives by post and then handling the vast amount of material that was coming back. So that took up a lot of time. And at the same time, over the decade, the demand for access to the original mass observation material was accelerating. So we were also running a small public service, a small reading room. So I combined this with managing this, with producing some publications, doing a little bit of my own research, plus some teaching and public speaking about mass observation, which was just what Tom Harrison would have wanted, I think. And as time went on, however, my role started to change. I was seduced by what was arriving every day: stories, opinions, photographs, drawings, brass rubbings, cartoons, feelings, arguments, experiences from all over the country. And I felt we had an obligation to these writers to take care of their contributions. And I started to want to get involved in the generation of the themes. And by 1990, when David retired, I took over directing the whole lot.
Thanks, Dorothy. I've got one last question for you. Looking at this resource now, having had such a history with mass observation projects, how would you articulate its value?
I almost feel it's not for me to say, but I think what we achieved was another unique collection which complements the original mass observation, a social document of Britain in the 1980s, and of course beyond. There's more to come. It was also an experiment in participatory social research or social history. I saw the writers for mass observation as collaborating with us. I know it isn't ever possible to entirely shift the power relations in research, but for a time I think we enabled a community of writers, people who believed in the project themselves and the importance of their role in it, who wanted to have their voices heard, and who shared in the idea that mass observation originally thought of attempting an anthropology at home, as you said right at the beginning, or a science of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. I'm now going to pass back to Alex.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire, and very much thank you to Dorothy as well. I'm just going to move on the slide now, and we're going to be hearing from Dr. Jill Kirby, who's a lecturer in history at the University of Sussex. She's going to talk to us about using these directives to teach 1980s Britain.
So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about using the MOP material in teaching and also in my own research. I teach a number of different courses that look at the history of Britain in the 1980s. Particularly, I lead the Making History module for the foundation year at Sussex. And I use the 1980s and the material in MOP at the very beginning of that year. So it's the first thing that students look at when we start studying history at foundation year level. I also use it with second year undergraduates in a time and place short period course, which is 1984 Thatcher's Britain. And I've used it in other institutions as well, in 20th century survey courses and in courses where we look at sort of methodology. And I think one of the main things that it has value for me in teaching is it's a really good way into primary source work for students, particularly if they haven't done history at A level, which a lot of my foundation year students haven't. Then it's a very accessible source. And I mean that in a couple of ways. The 1980s are quite accessible to the generation of undergraduates that I'm teaching because it's their parents' period, if you like. It's when their parents were young. And so they've heard stuff, they've seen things in popular culture, they've got a sort of grasp of a framework of ideas of what was going on in the 1980s. And that's really helpful to sort of build on at the very beginning of their undergraduate career to sort of help them develop a framework. But it's also accessible, as I hope you can see from the slide, because in many cases it's quite readable. And for manuscripts, that's often not the case. The examples I put in the slide, the 3 of them are handwriting and there's one printed one. And I think what they also get when they look at material across the 1980s in MOP is a sense of the influence of changing technology too. Because as you look at what the directives were asking and you look at what the respondents were saying, more and more of them are actually printed or computer generated. And so if they're typed and printed, they're obviously much more readable than handwriting sometimes is. So my students find it much easier to get to grips with what's being said. So I use the material in assignments and assessment exercises. I use it for students to do analysis. The most recent one I think we had them working on was a directive from 1987 from the general election, just a short paragraph that a woman writer had contributed talking about the evening of the election and the next day. And in that short paragraph, she covered a huge range of material in terms of the key themes that we'd been looking at. She talked about her eldest child's unemployment. She talked about her neighbours' different voting patterns, but the fact that both of them were buying their council houses. And she talked about people's personal views about Margaret Thatcher. So the students can actually get quite a lot out of quite small amounts of material. It's also really helpful in things thinking about periodization. In 1990, in the spring, there's a retrospective directive that asks the respondents to look back over the period. And that's really useful in getting students to think about, what do we mean by the 1980s? Is it really fixed as a decade, or are we thinking about a longer period of time, or indeed a shorter period of time? So it's good to do that sort of examination of how we use periodization in history. And it's also been very useful for students, particularly in the second year course that I teach, where the assignment is essentially an independent research project. And so they can use mass observation project material to do research on a vast range of different topics. One that sticks in my mind particularly was a student a couple of years ago who was interested in popular representation of class and decided to do his research on a probably now long forgotten BBC sitcom called To the Manor Born, which was about, yeah, it was a class thing. But within the directives, there is a directive about people's TV watching habits. So there was material that he could go to and get kind of really first-hand views of how people were watching and what they were watching to help him put that project together. Thinking about the directives, there is a huge amount of material covering a vast range of topics. I've picked out a handful there that you can see on the slide, many of which I've worked on both in teaching and research. What I would say is the titles of the directives by no means give you the full picture of the kind of content that's in there. For example, in the work directive, which I have used a lot for my research, you get material about the work that people were doing in the 1980s, how they felt about their work, the kind of jobs they had aspired to as children. But you also have questions that ask about their parents' work. So you don't just get the 1980s, you also get material that takes you back much earlier in the century. And certainly some of the ones that I looked at, they were talking about their parents in the interwar period and the work that they did and their attitudes to work. So you're actually getting a much richer picture than just the 1980s material. And that's the same in several of the directives. But there's also, you have a kind of key question, but there are often lots of sub-questions within there as well. And that means that you're getting a wider range of material within a topic like social well-being or the election or whatever. If I think then about how brilliantly useful it is for research, then I've spent a lot of time in the archive using the MOP directives for my own research, which is into the history of stress in Britain in the 20th century. And to my chagrin, there was no directive on stress, which isn't terribly surprising. So in terms of looking for material, I had to take a kind of sideways approach. Which directives might have stuff about stress in? The work one was an obvious one. Which sort of topics might prompt people to write about stress? So for me, researching stress meant reading through every single contribution to the work directive, to the social wellbeing directive, and to a couple of other ones later on. And that's brilliant, but very time consuming. And one of the really amazing things about this new digitized version is you can put a keyword in and search, and it will find your keyword not just in printed text, but in handwritten text as well, which seems like a form of magic to me. I mean, if it had been available when I was doing my research, it probably would have taken me half the time to get the material that I was looking for. But I do think there is still value in taking those sideways approaches as well, not just keyword searches. If I had been able to keyword search 10 years ago when I was looking at it, I would have missed a lot, because actually people talk about stuff without using the keyword that you search for. There is a lot of material in there that I found about stress where people didn't necessarily use the word stress, so I would have missed a lot. So I think the advantages of this new version are many, but I think it also lends itself to still using some of the older approaches in terms of methodology. Use the keywords, but also do things like read all of the entries from one particular writer or a handful of writers, or read all of the responses to a particular directive, because there's so much in there. On that note, I would say this is not only a source for historians by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a social and cultural historian, but I also have a background in social science. And I think there's a lot of value for social scientists in the Mass Observation Project, both in this material from the 80s and in the more recent stuff that will be coming eventually. Particularly, I've noted in the stuff that I've read, partly because of what I'm looking at, a lot of material about health that I'm not sure has actually been particularly researched or mined yet. And some of that is stuff that I think would fit particularly well in social science. So it's not just for historians, although clearly we love it. The last thing I would say is that it's full of hidden gems. It is worth taking time to do different ways of searching. The example I've put on screen is from a directive in spring 1984, which was about social well-being. And it included a very quantitative survey, actually, that had been deliberately included by one of the research groups within Sussex University. Didn't ask about stress at all. It asked about nervousness and tension, but it didn't ask about stress. And as I say, mostly it was quite quantitative. But at the very end of that survey, they had said, as you can see on the screen, is there anything more general you'd like to tell us about your health? And happily, many of them did have something to say. And this example was particularly useful to me. The writer talks about being put on tranquilizers by their doctor because the doctor says that they're suffering from stress. And you can see stress is in inverted commas there. And that was critical for me in my research, in that one of the things that I was arguing happened in the 1980s was that people started to adopt the use of stress to describe their own experiences. Prior to that, people hadn't really used the terminology, they'd used other words. And so the fact that the writer put it in inverted commas as a sort of thing that was maybe new, or a terminology that they were trying to indicate was somehow different to them, I thought was really significant. And so it's just an example of how beautifully the things that we're looking for, or indeed the things we're not looking for, we didn't realize we were looking for, are there in the detail, in the depths of these accounts by really ordinary people. And again, I would reiterate what Dorothy said, it's about ordinary people's accounts. And I think that's what I have found so absolutely joyous about using it. There is all sorts of different material in there that just brings to life ordinary people's lives. And I'll stop there before I go on forever.
Thank you very much, Jill. That was fantastic. I am just going to move to the next slide because we're going to be taking a look at the new digital site. So this is the new online site. So this was published in June this year, and this is the first of 3 modules. Module 1 is going to be covering the directives from 1981 up until 1991. And what I'm going to do now is just take 15 minutes to show you around the new site, particularly focusing on some of those search or browse methodologies that Jill was highlighting there. What I really want to show you is the different ways in which you can access both the directives and the responses through search and through browse. But before we get into those, I just want to direct you first of all to the Nature and Scope page. This is going to be under Research Tools. So if you ever need information about the origins of this collection, how to read a directive, or some information about how the material was collected and selected for this digital site, Nature and Scope is going to be the place to come. So here you can read a little bit about the Mass Observation Archive itself, how the material was selected, and also some notes on redaction and data protection as well. I would also recommend looking at the user's guide as well. So particularly if this is something that you would be interested in showing students or in integrating into teaching, the user guide is going to give a basic introduction to what an observer is, what a directive is, and also how the responses are set out as well. So I just scroll back to the top. Just a reminder that that's the Nature and Scope and the user's guide, which are going to be set here. If you need even more help on browsing the Mass Observation project, I'd recommend going to the help pages as well. I won't go to those now, but the help pages are in a separate site, and there's some useful tutorials there on searching, some information on Boolean operators, there's information on how to save searches. So it's a really useful hub for students particularly. Just going to go back to the home page. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at browsing the directives, browsing by directive. So here you can see we've listed every directive in the site. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to 1987 Spring Part 2. So this directive covered two different topics. So I'm going to click into the actual directive itself, which is just here. Again, so once I click into a document, I can move it around and zoom in and out. You can see we have our metadata at the bottom here, as well as summary. And then if I come over to this tab, you'll be able to see the transcript for this document as well. So if I just make this full screen for you, you'll see that this Spring 87 directive actually covers two topics that aren't necessarily related in any way, and this is quite common to have two topics in one directive that weren't necessarily linked. So if I come over to page 2 of this directive, we can see here that actually part 2 was asking people about their opinions on the media portrayal of the government's AIDS campaign, a public information campaign. So really they're asking about their impressions of the media campaign, as well as people's attitudes towards people who were becoming sick with HIV/AIDS. So once we've found the directive, we can actually then start moving through the responses. So we can do that in alphabetical order just by going through to the next document here. Or I can go back to the documents list to view all of the responses as well as the directive. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come into this first response here. As you can see, this is a response from respondent A1108, and all of our respondents are listed, have their own sort of unique number, and I'll show you why that's important in a minute. Now, a lot of these responses were from people who had first-hand experience. You know, very often people would write about friends or family who are, you know, affected or were more involved in certain topics or phenomena So here we can see someone, so this is a male person born in the 1950s in London. Just looking at the metadata on the right hand side here. If I just open this response up, so this is one response to that directive on AIDS. If I come out, just a reminder that because this is typed, we can search the transcript as well. And that goes for any directive or any response in the site. Anything that is typed is going to be OCR full text searchable. What I'm going to do is come back to the documents list. I'm going to scroll down and we'll take a look at one more of these responses. So we'll look at this one here. So if I just make that slightly bigger. So this time we actually have a handwritten response. And as Jill mentioned, and as we're going to see as we're moving through the site, it's actually really common that we see both. We see a lot of handwritten responses. So what we've done to aid the searching of handwritten material is run them all through our handwritten text recognition. So if I just come to the search bar at the top here, you can see clearly there's no tab for a transcript, but we can search these documents as easily as the OCR transcribed ones. So what I've done is run a search for the word educate. And if I scroll in, you can see there that it's picking up one result for the word educate. So if you'd like to learn a bit more about our handwritten text recognition tool, that's going to be available in the research tools section. So you can read a bit more about how that tool works, some more information about false positives, and really how to utilize that. So I'm going to come back to the home page. So what I'm going to do now is we've looked at browsing by directives. This time I'm going to browse all documents. So sometimes, as I think Jill demonstrated really clearly, a topic or a field that maybe you're interested in may not be explicitly covered in the titling of a directive. Maybe it's actually hidden in the responses to the directive under something else. So the way we've kind of ensured a slightly more rounded search experience, first of all, is being able to browse by document. So we can utilize these filters on the left-hand side here. So I can filter by region. So maybe I only want to look at responses from London, for example. Maybe I only want to look at people who are answering a single. Maybe I only want to look at male or female respondents. Or I can also refine by age as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just keep my filter for London, and I'm actually going to refine by directive as well. So I'm going to look for 1984 summer. I'm going to apply those filters. So now, as we can see in the filters at the top here, I'm just looking at responses from London for the 1984 summer directive. Now, one thing that's worth noting is you can see these key topics that are attached to all of our responses. If I just click into this B35 response, you'll be able to see those slightly more clearly. So this is, clearly a response to a directive about electronic banking and how that's changed people's financial habits or how they pay for things. But very often people's talk of money or savings or how they spend their resources isn't actually limited to the directives that specify it. So the way we've tried to accommodate that is with these key topics. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to click money here. So by having a controlled vocabulary in the site, what we've been able to do is identify key topics that span far beyond the sort of siloed directives that maybe they're being asked to talk about specific topics. And what we can actually do is, as we can see here in my my search criteria at the top, is I've filtered to every response and every directive that covers money. And we can see a variety of different directives themselves that cover that topic. But if I start scrolling down, I'm able to see a lot of responses to a huge variety of directives that cover those topics as well in different contexts. And I think that's the really important thing. Now, this isn't limited to one. If I scroll back to the top, a really new and unique way that the digital site offers search potential is what we call key topic filtering. So I just come to the filter options at the top here. I can either filter by observer. So we saw that every observer has a unique number. You can see everything that observer has written or responded to. But also you can filter by key topics as well. Now, because we have this controlled vocabulary, what we can do is we can actually start combining key terms. So maybe I just want to look for any response or any directive that relates to the royal family and the royal wedding. Maybe I'm interested in the Soviet Union and alcohol, or the Soviet Union and morality, money and inflation, and unemployment. That maybe those three topics together. I can take any of these three, or any two, or any combination. And we can see that I have them tagged here, and I can search the entire set of directives for those two topics combined. Again, if my search results are too expansive, what I can do is maybe filter those results slightly more. So maybe I'm only interested in those two topics and responses from London. Again, so that whittles it down to about 600 results, which is slightly more manageable than 4,000. Okay. So one of the last things I'll talk about is when you do find something that's of interest, we can do two different things to save that for later. First of all is we can download any document to PDF, given that if you have access to it. So that's just using the download button here. We can also just bookmark documents as well. We have to sign in to our my archive login here. So all you do is set up a really quick account and you can save as many images or as many documents as you like. And you can also download a PDF, as I just mentioned. So we've looked at those key topic filters, we've looked at how to browse. There is also just a really simple search function. So this is going to search the metadata and the full text for everything. So I've just run a search for Greenwich there. And we can see all of the responses, all of our search results here. Again, if we need to filter those down, we can use the filters on the left-hand side. when I click into a response, it's going to show me my search results highlighted here. So this is a full text result about the 1987 general election. Okay, so last thing I'll mention is just at the bottom here, when I run a search, I'm going to be able to see where my search result is appearing in the document at the bottom here. So I can, image 2 and image 5 are showing results. Okay. So hopefully that's given you a good indication to what mass observation is and really how to get around this site. The last thing I will mention is we do also have some really fantastic academic essays and videos. You know, we work really closely, obviously, with the Keep and plenty of scholars at the University of Sussex, but we do work with, you know, a range of scholars to help curate and to help write academic essays and build context for all of our projects. And that doesn't stop with Mass Observation Project either. So here you can see just a range of academic essays that help situate these archival sources. If you want a bit more information about the scholars and the archivists who worked with us, the editorial board is listed here under Research Tools. And I shall stop there. So I'll just take us back to the home page. So hopefully that's given you a better understanding of what's in the site and how to use it. I'm just going to pause this and head over to our slide deck again. So we are just coming up to 10:02. So I will open this time for some questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the questions tab. And I will filter them out. So I'm just reading through some of the questions we've had submitted here. So we have one question here that I will take, which is from Darren. So thank you very much for your question. Darren asks, can we get institutional access via university libraries? The answer is yes. I will share some information on the final slide on how you can you know, progress that. So yes, is the answer. I will see what other questions do we have. Okay, we have another question from Martin, but hopefully that's 2 in 1. Martin, I'll share some information on library subscriptions or library purchasing in a second. Okay, we have a question, another technical question, which I will take from LJ Hutchins, who asks, how would you rate the accuracy of the handwriting recognition tool? And the answer is very highly. I don't have a percentage response, but luckily the handwriting for most people in 1980s Britain is actually very easy to decipher. So for context, we train our handwriting text recognition on a sample of, you know, manually transcribed images, and we've done this for, you know, other more complex projects like our East India Company and Colonial America projects, in which, you know, the handwriting is much more cursive, much more archaic. So actually the accuracy is, yeah, extremely high. If you go to the handwritten text recognition page within Mass Observation Project, hopefully once you get access, there's a bit more information there about our false positive slanting and how we sort of account for those. So we have a question from Paul Horsler. Again, it's another technical one, so I will take it. What arrangements are in place for text and data mining? So any institution that has access will have access to the XML, which includes all of the transcripts for OCR materials. Anything that's handwritten won't unfortunately be included in that, but all of the directives and all of the typed responses that we've been able to OCR will be fully available for text and data mining following purchase. Question from Moira, is this module cross-searchable with earlier mass observation digital products? Yes, very simply. When you run a search, it will actually, there'll be an AM Explorer pop-up in the bottom right-hand corner, and you'll be able to cross-search the site with the earlier mass observation online. Question from Simon. Oh, it's just not really a question or comment, just saying thank you. So thank you, Simon. Okay, so we have a question here, another question from Darren. So I'll come back to Darren's second question. So I'll read this out and then maybe I'll assign it following that. Darren asks, does social media give better insights now, or are there more directed insights, or are the more directed insights better to elicit the detailed reflective accounts still? And which you think, sorry. I'm coming back to your question, Darren. I just need to get my head around phrasing that. Do we have any more at the bottom here? So one more question from Paul. Is there information available on the number of actual respondents for each directive? Within the site, yes. All you would do is you browse to an individual directive. Obviously, the directive is one, and then you could just look at how many responses there were in the search results within the site. So hopefully it's really clear when you're sort of browsing by directive just how many responses there are. Okay, so I'll just leave the questions open for one more minute, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. Okay, so I'll just finish, I think, maybe with, I suppose, Darren, your initial question, and then I think there's a response here from LJ Hutchins as well, and maybe I'll sort of mold those two things and put it to our speakers. So Darren and LJ Hutchins are discussing, so I'll read Darren's initial question first. So Darren, with the, oh yeah, so there was a typo there. Darren asks, does social media give better insights now, or are the more directed insights better to elicit the detailed reflective accounts, and which do you think are more valid? So I think what Darren and LJ Hutchins, who is also asking about the difference perhaps between social media as a space for expressing opinion and the more, I suppose, closed space of writing or responding to mass observation directives. Does anyone maybe want to comment on that, on maybe the difference of responses, or the difference in response that someone would maybe get from reading a mass observation directive response in comparison to maybe someone writing on social media? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Alex, I think I do, and also Dorothy does.
Okay, yeah.
Should we go ahead?
You could start.
I mean, I would say that I'm not sure it's a question of things being better. I think they're just different. They give us different insights. I think what mass observation, the real strength of mass observation, is that it's written through a relationship over time. So you have people who have continued to build a relationship with mass observation. So a kind of intimacy grows over time. I think also in comparison to Twitter or other forms of social media, mass observation is a kind of interesting space. It's both public and private. Mass observers know that they're providing their words, their lives for a public archive, but there's also an intimate relationship with that archive that means that they express at some length quite intimate details of their lives. So that's what I think. Dorothy?
Mass observation prefigured the social media, but there is this context of relationship. I mean, we did feel that we knew some of the people who wrote, and people get more frank the longer they take part. So I think it is different. It's also much easier to use because it's thematic and you can find what people are saying about things. Certainly now with Adam Mackey, you can find them beautifully.
Absolutely. I think that is the last of our questions, and we are, well, literally bang on time. So I will take this time very quickly to just move to this final slide. So for those of you that were asking, if you'd like more information about how to access a trial or some more information about getting access to the Mass Observation Project, please feel free to either email us, and you can see that top email address there. You can go to our website as well and request a free trial through that. If you'd like more information about the archive, please do tweet them. They are an extremely friendly bunch of people and can answer any questions you have. Or feel free to tweet us as well. Particularly if you'd like to extend this conversation beyond the webinar, we'd love to continue with it on social media. Okay, and with that, I will just say a massive thank you to everyone for attending today. And of course, a huge thank you to our speakers. Just a reminder, they were Professor Claire Langhammer, Dorothy Sheridan, Jill Kirby, and myself, Alex Butler, Adam Matthew as well. And please do look out for the recording in the next 2 days. And a massive thank you for joining us. Bye, everyone.